Hello, Matthew Bell with InsurancePrescription.com, and today I wanted to talk about the question of how much do you need to actually retire. We often hear sort of a proverbial, you need $1 million in order to retire. Recently, I've noted articles that have started to flash, you need $2 million to retire. And so the question is, what is the actual number? Is there an actual number? Let's talk through a few of the issues. Usual disclaimer, I am not a financial advisor. I cannot give you specific advice regarding finances, insurance, investments, savings, tax advice. No specific advice. This is simply just me talking through some of the relevant concerns in the hopes that something might spark your imagination or help you to think through these issues for yourself and your family. If you need personalized recommendations, you need to consult a licensed professional in your area. One obvious point to make right from the beginning is that the amount of money you're going to need to retire is going to be very specific to your situation. And there's a number of reasons for this that are somewhat obvious, but let's just make mention of them anyway. One is going to be the fact that your income and expenses now are going to be unique to you. Your expenses, insofar as they're going to carry forward into retirement, are also going to be unique to you. Probably some expenses are going to change a little bit. Some might go down. For example, your mortgage might get paid off, and some might go up. For example, the cost of health care or your need for long-term care might increase. It's also going to depend on the area that you live in and your lifestyle. For some people who live in an area that doesn't have a high cost of living, they might be able to get by on less. For other people who live in a higher cost of living area, obviously they're going to need more income to support them in that area. A further consideration is going to be what their conception of retirement is in terms of their plans. Do you want to be able to take a vacation? Do you want to be able to join a country club? Do you want to be able to buy a boat? What do you want to be able to do in retirement? And if you have ambitions to do some of those things, then you're going to need to figure out some way of funding them. So the more you anticipate spending in retirement, the more money you're going to need. Fairly intuitive. This brings up an immediate follow-up question, and that is, when we ask the question of how much money do you need in retirement, are we talking about income or are we talking about assets? Now, if we're talking about income, we often hear that in order to prepare for retirement, you want to assume that you're going to have to replicate 70 to 80% of your pre-retirement income. And so you can easily figure that out. Let's just say you're making $100,000 pre-retirement. Well, then 70 to 80% of that gross income would be $70,000 to $80,000. So the projection in that case is to prepare for a contingency in which you would be able to retire if you are able to come up with enough income and assets in retirement to replicate a $70,000 to $80,000 a year income stream. But other people say no, that's not the most relevant consideration. They'll say what you really need to concern yourself with is what your expenses are going to be, because your pre-retirement income is one thing, but your retirement expenses are something else. And when rubber actually meets the road in retirement, what you're going to have to be paying for is your expenses. So their recommendation is to calculate your projections for expenses in retirement and then go off those figures. So it might be that if you're making $100,000 pre-retirement, you might need $100,000 in retirement. It might be that if you're making $100,000 pre-retirement, you might be able to get by with $80,000 in retirement, but not because of some arbitrary calculation, simply because that is what your expense projections dictate. Now, there are a number of authorities now online who will throw a question mark behind the idea that you will be able to retire with $1 million. There are a number of things right now. If you just Google, can I retire with $1 million? Many of the top hits are dominated by sources that are skeptical of that number or that caution you against hanging your hat on that number and thinking that $1 million is somehow a magical number in retirement. For example, in an article on Dave Ramsey's website, although not authored by him, I think, the question is answered. It's asked and answered, can I retire on $1 million, by saying, well, probably not, but it's close. In other words, the calculations that were used in this particular article were that the average amount of expenses that people have nationwide in retirement are about $61,000. And what the gentleman writing the article then comes up with is the idea that you would actually need closer to $1.3 million in order to retire and be able to generate an income stream of $61,000. Now, one way to arrive at $61,000 with $1,330,000, which was the figure in the article, is to ask yourself what rate of return would be necessary on $1.3 million in order to generate $61,000 a year. And the answer to that question is 4.59%. approximately. In another video, and I'll put the link in the description, I go over 7 different conceptions of how retirement actually can proceed, different conceptions of how you might actually retire. In a further video following some of those themes up and expanding on them a little bit, I talk about 4 different ways that you can use your personal retirement assets, because ultimately it isn't going to be about your assets as much as it's going to be about creating income. You're going to need income. You need income to pay for property taxes, and you need income to pay for groceries and utility bills. Even if your mortgage is paid off, you're still going to need income on an ongoing basis. And so your retirement is going to be at least as much about your income as it is about your assets. So don't necessarily get too focused on a particular end number. Keep in mind that the end number, let's say $1 million, $2 million, whatever it happens to be, that number is only a means ultimately to trying to make sure you can cover the various expenses that you're going to have in retirement, or not just cover your expenses, but be able to live the lifestyle that you want to live in retirement. Now, these can be sobering numbers, because there are going to be viewers who are going to essentially say, $1 million, $2 million, this is far beyond what I anticipated. According to an article recently on Investopedia, when I was researching the Secure Act, it says that the median amount of money in a 401k for those who are 65 years of age or older, the median amount is around $58,000. $58,000 in a 401k. Now, if you consider that you would need, let's say, approximately $50,000, is just an easy number to work with. Let's say you need $50,000 a year to live, and you have a $58,000 401k. Well, once you've paid the tax on that money, it's doubtful that you would even be able to make it through 1 year living off that money. Certainly the interest generated on $58,000 is not going to be enough, even at a 10% rate of return, is not going to be enough to propel you any meaningful distance into retirement. We're talking literally 1 year at best of retirement if you had to live exclusively off the 401k. Now remember, there are other streams of income potentially available to you. Social Security would be one. If you have an employer pension, that would be another one. You can consult, once again, the video that I did on the various conceptions of retirement to kind of get a handle on what the various options are here. Maybe you have rental properties. There can be a lot of things that are relevant here. But if we're just thinking about your personal retirement assets and you have something in the neighborhood of $58,000, $60,000, that's not going to meaningfully propel you forward into retirement. And what you're going to be looking at there is something like what they call a hybrid retirement, where you're going to have at least some part-time income, probably from some kind of a job that you continue to do even in retirement in order to supplement your Social Security, let's say, or your ability to draw from such a modest 401k. But at the same time, another option that's available to some people is going to be to try and cut their expenses. So as was done in the article posted on Dave Ramsey's website, if we're assuming $61,000 a year in expenses, one way to try and propel a smaller amount, to try and use a smaller amount of saved assets for a longer period of time, is going to be to try and bring those expenses down. So if you're able to bring those expenses down meaningfully, of course, you can protract the amount of time that your assets will last. So once again, this is going to bring up the idea that you're going to need to have some fix on what your expenses are going to be. We don't have a crystal ball, of course, and ultimately these are going to just be projections. But you're going to have at least something you're aiming at in terms of understanding what your expenses are likely to be in retirement and what you want your lifestyle to be. Once again, do you want it to simply be you living at home? Do you want to be taking vacations and traveling the world? Then you're going to have to plan and budget for whichever option suits you best. Now, there are a number of rules of thumb that can come into play at this point. So one rule of thumb has it that you can take the amount of money that you need to have in a given year and divide that number by 4% to arrive at a rough estimate of how much you would need to retire given that income requirement. So for instance, if we take $50,000 and we divide $50,000 by 0.04%, then we would arrive at $1.25 million. Now that indicates that according to this particular calculation strategy, if you knew that you needed $50,000 a year in expenses, the rule would suggest that you needed $1.25 million in assets in order to generate that amount. Now once again, if you're going to rely in part on Social Security, let's say Social Security in your case is going to pay for $20,000. just making the number up, then your division problem would actually be $30,000 divided by 4%, because you're assuming $20,000 of the 50 that you need is going to be coming from a different source. So we're asking the question, how much do you need in the way of assets in order to make your retirement plan complete? Now, a similar phraseology for ultimately the same procedure is going to be to take the income that you need per year and multiply it by 25. So if you take $50,000 and multiply it by 25, again, you get $1.25 million. And the idea here is the same as before. It's supposed to give you a rough and ready idea of how much you need in the way of assets in order to retire, given your income needs. Now, further variation on these principles that you might find is what's called the $1,000 a month rule. The idea here is that if you know that you need $1,000 a month, you can backwards engineer the amount that you would need to have in retirement personal savings, given a particular rate of return, to generate that as income. Now here, it's going to depend on the rate of return that you get. I would invite you to consult the video that I have on the 4 different ways to use retirement assets, because some people think of retirement assets right off the bat as simply a piggy bank. So you have $1 million in a piggy bank and you're just going to sort of pull money out of that piggy bank as you need it. Many investment managers and money managers are going to have an altogether different conception. Essentially, on their conception, you're going to keep that $1 million in an account, and it's only going to be the interest or the rate of return, the yield that's generated from that account, that you're going to touch. So on a 5% rate of return, again, making the numbers up, on $1 million, a 5% rate of return would give you $50,000 a year. So the picture would be, if you were able to guarantee 5% rate of return every year, you could, in theory, take $50,000 out of your account every year and never touch the principal, never touch that $1 million. Now, in practice, of course, this is very hit and miss, because trying to have an investment vehicle that returns 5% every year like clockwork is extraordinarily elusive at best. But the $1,000 a month rule is bound up with this, because oftentimes you'll find somebody will say something like, for every $1,000 that you know you need every month, then you can assume you're going to need $240,000 or thereabouts in personal retirement assets in order to generate $1,000 a month. And all they're doing here is they're taking a 5% rate of return and they're multiplying it by a certain amount. So $240,000 times 5% rate of return is $12,000. And if you took $12,000 out over the course of a year, divided by 12 months in a year, would be $1,000 a month. So the idea here would be, if you had $240,000 in savings and you were getting a 5% rate of return, then you could take out $12,000 and expect to have $1,000 of actual income. Now, we're ignoring tax situation. Is that money taxable? Is it not taxable? How is it taxed? All of these things are being put off to the side just to help get a fix on the actual raw numbers. So if you knew, on the other hand, that you needed $4,000 a month, then you would know you would need $240,000 times 4 in order to generate the amount of return that you would require. And of course, in that case, $240,000 times 4 is $960,000, which is close to the $1 million that we've been talking about. If you needed $4,000 a month, which is $48,000 a year, then you would need $960,000 in personal retirement assets, making 5% rate of return, that then you could draw that return off and fund your retirement. Now, at this point, I should at least say we've been talking about numbers. We've been talking about 4%, 5%. The 4% rule is a kind of a maxim, and it goes back to a financial advisor by the name of William Bengen. And Bengen articulated a 4% rule in an article that he actually wrote, an academic article. And in that article, he describes what he thinks is the safe maximum withdrawal rate that a person can make from a retirement account in terms of personal savings. And he says that that's 4%. Now, he's going on a time horizon of approximately 30 years, which means that he thinks if you have a certain account, you can safely withdraw 4% from that account and expect the money to hold out for about 30 years without running into a problem. His conception that he articulated was extraordinarily dependent on a particular mix of stocks. So when you look at projections that are made regarding how you can use your money, you're always going to have to ask the question, what rate of return is assumed? But in addition to that, you're going to have to ask, what mix of stocks and bonds, what portfolio allocation was also assumed. So in Bengen's case, if I understand correctly, he was assuming 60% stocks, 40% bonds, and when you do that, according to his calculations, based on the rates of return that he was seeing when he wrote the article, and bear in mind, this article goes back to the 1990s, when he wrote the article, the rates of return seemed to bear out the fact that a 4% withdrawal rate was safe and could propel you forward at least 30 years without you having to be concerned about running out of money. But if you have a different allocation, if you have different risk tolerances, then the first thing to understand is that Bengen's 4% rule is all of a sudden going to have a question mark hung behind it in terms of its applicability to your situation. The other thing is, number two, that if you look up, if you Google 4% rule today, what you're going to find is a number of skeptical articles that dominate the Google search results. And part of the reason for that is the interest rate environment, the market environment is notably different than it was when Bengen was writing the article. There are a lot of concerns about the 4% rule. 4%, according to one authority, is too much to guarantee safety of your principal in a low interest rate environment. Now, what's the bottom line? Well, once again, these numbers are very difficult to get a handle on and very difficult to make generalized recommendations about because they're going to be sensitively dependent on what your expenses are, what your environment is, what your projections are, what your conception of retirement is, where you live. One obvious takeaway is that the more money you have, the more confidence you can have in your retirement plan, particularly if you live well below your means. So, for example, if you think that you're going to need $50,000 in retirement, you could conceivably do that with $500,000 invested in a vehicle that was consistently kicking off 10% rate of return. But the question would be, do you really want to count on a 10% rate of return occurring year after year? Because it's unlikely. In the market, we think about an average rate of return, which means some years are going to do better, some years are going to do worse, and they're simply going to average to 10%. Well, in a year when you do worse than 10%, then it is going to start to erode your principal, and it's going to affect your retirement projections. If you have $1 million, you could generate $50,000 with 5%. It's a much more conservative way of approaching things, but you could even think about it this way. If you had $2 million in retirement, then with a 2.5% rate of return, you'd be able to generate the same $50,000. And the question here is, which would you rather hang your hat on? Getting a 10% rate of return on $500,000, getting a 5% rate of return on $1 million, or getting a 2.5% rate of return on $2 million. Obviously, you can't wave a magic wand at the age of 65 or 67 or 60 and magically double, triple, or quadruple or more the amount that's in your 401k. You have to play the cards that you're dealt. But the moral of the story is, if you can manage to increase your amount of retirement savings, it's going to give you options. It's going to give you peace of mind. In upcoming videos, I'm going to explore further some of these themes. But for the time being, let's just kind of think about it in terms of the projections that are made because they're assuming a particular rate of return. So the reason for the big numbers, 1 million, 2 million, is that when you are considering a conservative return, and 5% is considered by many authorities to be a conservative rate of return, then if you're considering that you would get a 5% rate of return, what would be the minimum amount you would need? Because the average amount of expenses in the United States are upwards of $50,000, the projections are that a person really would need to have more than $1 million now in order to retire with peace of mind. But once again, we're ignoring Social Security, we're ignoring pensions, we're ignoring a number of other different things that might come into play. I'll have to pick up some of these threads in subsequent videos, but for the time being, I'll say if you found something of use in this video, please like it, please subscribe to the channel, please click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. I thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thank you so much.